So while Liz is getting ready for the last topic, we have three things: the remediation general permit, the EJ policy, and the vulnerability assessment that we all just heard about. And obviously, we're packing a lot in today. So I think maybe we can set aside some time at our next meeting to take a deep breath, and your homework assignment can be to think about all three of those topics and think about kind of what the implications are and what you would recommend, DEP and particularly wayside cleanup would be for next steps. How you think, for instance, the vulnerability assessment. Where do we go from here? Kind of what can we do to make people more aware of that? Are there any activities that need to be changed at waste sites to kind of have the discussion that we really should have with these? So maybe we can set aside some time next time.
And as far as next time, I think we are expecting that we will have a meeting next month in April, right, Paul? And then skip May and have a meeting in June. And as far as this discussion today about the groundwater 1 amendments under consideration, I had talked about having some meetings where we could actually spend a lot more time going through the proposals. And that's not this discussion today. And it didn't happen since our last meeting in January because we were needing to do two things. One was talk about the different proposals with the wayside cleanup senior staff, and then also check in with particularly our drinking water program, and also do some GIS analysis that Brian Brodeur has been very helpful with. So that's why we didn't manage to schedule any meetings ahead of today. And what I'd like to do today is just kind of set the table for additional discussions, and also give you an indication, since we did have time to talk within wayside cleanup, and also just to a brief conversation with the drinking water program, tell you how we're leaning on certain things within wayside cleanup. In terms of what we think we want to pursue and what we don't. So I just want to remind you, we have a list of potential amendments that includes some of these groundwater 1 plus a lot of other topics. It's good just to go over the definitions of groundwater 1 areas. They're both current drinking water areas and potential drinking water source areas. The current are the Zone 2s, interim wellhead protection areas, the Zone A's around surface water bodies that are used as drinking water supplies, and a 500-foot radius around private water supply wells. And the potential drinking water source areas are in undeveloped areas that are 500 feet or greater from a public water supply distribution line. Those are likely to be future private well areas if there is any development in those areas. So those are reserved as GW1 areas for potential future supplies. Aquifer protection districts or other kind of municipal or government set-asides of aquifers for drinking water purposes, and potentially productive aquifers that are medium and high yield aquifers as mapped by MassGIS, and all aquifers east of the Cape Cod Canal, which includes the islands as well, except for those that are designated or have been determined to be non-potential drinking water source areas. So we start with potentially productive aquifers and then overlay some criteria, and you can exclude some of those areas as not potential drinking water source areas and redefine them as non-potential drinking water source areas. Sorry for that. Oh.
I just have a question on the non-potential drinking water source area.
I hate that ball.
I was recently looking at the old policy that describes what would be a non-potential drinking water source.
We're getting him with the
It's
camera
in the
that is
maps,
now.
the SGS maps, used as guides. And doing some asking
the camera
around,
on the
it
corner.
sounds like it's up to the LSP to decide whether the area is a non-potential drinking water source area or not. But who makes the final determination?
Well, that's a good point, and I hope to get to that, mention that at some point. So let's talk about that now. So non-potential drinking water source area criteria you find in the definition section of the MCP. And we also have, in addition to that, a policy that shows, okay, here's how you apply this. And it's what we did when we first put this definition in place is we, meaning MassGIS and Bureau of Wayside Cleanup, and going to all the different towns and having them look at draft maps, did our first overlay of non-potential drinking water source areas. So we mapped those based on this definition and based on what we can figure out from land use, looking at ortho photos, these fit this, and we dropped those areas out on the maps. But we realized that on the ground, there's probably information that we couldn't see from the ortho photos. So there's the ability for the LSP to say, hey, I have this area, it meets all of these criteria. This should also be part of the non-potential drinking water source area. What we have done, but we don't have a standardized process for this, is on occasion, we would get involved in a review, either because somebody came to us up front and said, could you look at this, and do you agree with me? I think it's a non-potential drinking water source area. And when we have agreement, some of those have made it onto the map, but not necessarily all of those. It's been kind of a resource issue where we haven't set up a process for getting those onto the maps. In other cases, an LSP doesn't really know whether DEP agrees with how they determine an area to be non-potential drinking water source area until we conduct an audit and we don't make an issue of it. So a site was audited and there was some agreement that it was done correctly. One of the things I think we would like to standardize going forward, and this is not a reg issue but more of a process issue, is that we do this more consistently. I talked with MassGIS about this, and they thought we could commit to an annual update of those maps. So they don't want to be having to do this every time something is sent in to them, but where it's either gone through a DEP audit or there's been some DEP concurrence, that then we would make sure we got those areas added. So that's not really related to changes in terms of amendments, but that's trying to do that more consistently, I think would be helpful.
So who would be the point of contact if there was a question?
A question about the mapping?
Yeah, we had
Site-specific.
Site-specific additional information. There was a lagoon here that didn't show up, and we want some feedback from DEP as to whether or not this would be considered.
Well, I have been the intake for some of those in the past. Sometimes people have gone directly to the DRD in the region. I know, here's where the consistency issue comes in. I know the Western region has participated in those discussions, and then they have a process of then making sure the maps get updated to reflect that. I know Southeast, I see Gerard back there. I know Southeast has done some of these as well. When someone contacts me, I usually end up having a discussion with Brian Brodeur, and Brian is super helpful in terms of providing his time for helping look at those proposals, or the way the LSP has been put the determination together. So the one thing I can't say is we can't always commit to like giving you an upfront answer in terms of time. Some of those have taken time. But what we do want to do is, once there has been a discussion and there is agreement, make sure that stuff ends up on the maps. Matt?
Liz, can you, you're clarifying though that what we're talking about is disputes over what land use was in place in what, January 1st, 1996 or whatever, which is the date referenced in that policy.
It's not always disputes. It might be that the way it was interpreted from the map was
Right, that's what I'm saying, but we're arguing over what existed in 1996.
That's right,
not
1996.
anything, that mysterious date that is set forever in stone, apparently.
Well, do you want me to proceed and get to that point?
Yes.
Okay, So I'm just going to quickly, that's one of the points of discussion, non-potential drinking water source areas, criteria, and whether we might change those, modify those, and most people are interested in expanding those. So I'm going to get to that. First, I just want to quickly talk about unrelated. This is related to a current drinking water source area, and we have an exception now where you have an area that's only a GW1 area because it's a Zone 2, and it may also have an adjoining aquifer protection district, but it's a Zone 2, and right now we have an exception that where the contamination is limited to oil, and you can demonstrate that, that's a site down there, you can demonstrate that the plume is stable and contracting, or and that the plume does not extend within 1,000 feet of that public water supply well, that you can exceed the GW1 concentrations for those oil constituents. But one issue we have with that is the way it's currently written is the starting criteria for applying this exception is that the contamination is limited to oil. So we have people that have had sites where they have other non-oil constituents that are meeting the GW1 standards, but the way it's written, they can't apply this exception. So in terms of a potential change, we, DEP, we also discussed this with water supply, are in agreement that that should be modified so that we make it clear that if you're otherwise, for all your other constituents, at or below the GW1 standards, then you can still use this exception. That may not even seem like a big deal, but it has hung up several sites, so that should be helpful. Now we're on to Matt's non-potential drinking water source area, and we had in that table of potential MCP changes, changes to consider with respect to expanding non-potential drinking water source area definition. And we put those in there based on, a lot of it was based on a presentation that Kevin O'Reilly had given to the LSPA, and took the things that he went through in that presentation and put them on the list. And I'll just say that when we put things on those lists, we had said, you know, here are things that people have identified. We're gonna put that on our starter list. Since then, Wayside Cleanup has had a discussion about which of these changes we feel comfortable with and which we do not. So I wanted to tell you about that. And Matt mentioned the first one is that the land uses that fall out as the commercial, industrial, dense residential, that fall out if you have sufficient area, 100 acres or more, as non-potential drinking water source area is fixed in time to January 1996. That's not an arbitrary date. That was the date that those maps were first developed. The reason the date was fixed in time, well, there are a couple of reasons, but one is that we could see in the future that over time, as more and more development happened, that we just would continue to eat away at those areas that were set aside as potential drinking water source areas. So that's why the date's fixed in time. The other is that we also envision that development in the future would be done in a way that wouldn't impact the underlying groundwater the way it had in the past. So better housekeeping, better systems to manage the land use and reduce the potential impacts to groundwater. So we have talked about this within Wayside Cleanup. We do not feel inclined to eliminate that date. We feel that it is important to have it represent the past development in the interest of preserving these areas, preserving areas for potential drinking water supply areas. And I know Massachusetts is considered a relatively water-rich state, but we also know that we have years where our water supplies are under stress, like this past year. So I think within the discussion that happened within Wayside Cleanup is there wasn't a lot of comfort with changing that date. Matt, do you want to comment? what?
Or need.
Or need, well, people see these things differently, but that was a discussion around the date. We did discuss this with water supply, and as you can imagine, they thought, they were in agreement with that as well. The other thing that we didn't feel comfortable with looking at is the bottom bullet there, allowing flexibility in the completely surround rule. So if you have these land uses that would meet the definition of non-potential drinking water source area, you might have an area in the middle that doesn't meet it, but the criteria says if the qualifying land uses completely surround it, and then that area in the middle is small, I forgot what it is, 10 acres or less, then you can absorb it and the whole area drops out. Our reason for not wanting to get into more discussion about flexibility is all of our groundwater criteria decisions, we have all different LSPs making these decisions, and we really need them to be able to be applied in a standardized way. And we were concerned that trying to get into some flexibility there would be more complicated than it would be worth. It would be very hard to sort of oversee how those decisions were being made. And we didn't really feel the need for it, or at this time wanting to put the time into thinking about that. So those are the two that, right off the top we are reluctant to look at. In terms of the other two proposals, to look at adding some additional land uses to commercial industrial landfills and wastewater treatment plants. We are looking at that right now, and we're inclined to do that. There are some issues in terms of definitions. With landfills, we want those to be permitted landfills, so it's really clear that we're distinguishing between active and closed permitted facilities versus unauthorized dumping areas. And then with wastewater treatment plants, I think there's probably an issue there too in terms of the size, because it's one thing to have a municipal wastewater treatment plant, and then you may have something much smaller that's associated with a condo development, for example. So there probably, when we look at that, there would be some size criteria. And the lot size, we are going to look at we're not committed to this yet, but we're doing an analysis of what it would mean to increase that to 1/3 of an acre. It really would not affect a lot of different communities, but there are a few where historically they had that kind of density of land use, and we could probably get that information. So that's something that we're working. GIS is going to do a couple towns and see what that looks like. I'll skip the definition. I think I highlighted. I'm just going to give you a few preliminary notes on the evaluation of the landfills. It's not surprisingly landfills, many of them are isolated to parts of the community where they're not attached to other land uses because of odors and nuisance problems. So if these isolated landfills are not going to be very helpful in terms of expanding non-potential drinking water source areas in a lot of cases. Here's an example where you have two mapped landfills, but just because of the size, they overlay a potentially productive aquifer, but they're not large enough. Here's a case where you would get some additional non-potential drinking water source area. The orange areas are different defined landfill areas, and then you also have a wastewater treatment plant facility. That's the existing non-potential drinking water source area. And then when you add the others in, you get an expanded area. But interestingly enough, it doesn't really add in terms of potential commercial sites nearby that might have an issue, a 21E program issue, and be cleaning up the groundwater. But here's a case where you would pick up a site. The landfill in orange, overlaying the aquifer. You have down on the right-hand side, you have some existing non-potential drinking water source area on one side of the highway there. And then were you to extend that and include the landfill, it would pick up that commercial property up at the top. So there are examples like that. This is another one, 2 landfills. There's an existing non-potential shaded area up there at the top, and then it would pick up some area in between and a little leg of area down below. That's a commercial property. So I think the bottom line is we want to pursue the landfills and the wastewater treatment plants. I don't know if it's going to affect a lot of sites just because of where they are located. GIS mapping update, that was that earlier conversation, and then we do have some additional topics that we're looking at. So I maybe go home and look at this slide, but this kind of fills out the rest of the topics. One of the ones I added at the bottom there, it's not really related to groundwater 1 necessarily, but and I've mentioned this previously, but we're interested in geolocating the monitoring wells. I'm glad you like that idea.
Work in New York.
There is what we're trying to figure out is there is an existing requirement with the well registration program that well drillers provide this information. So what we're trying to figure out is whether an LSP would just ensure that the well driller had provided the information or otherwise provided, or how we could not duplicate the work that's already supposed to be being done. So if you have any ideas about that, but this would be a great resource if we can get this all coming in electronically and merge it with the information we're already providing on the waste sites. So that's another thing to think about that I think you all probably have some ideas about how to best do that. So we'll talk more about this next month, and also we could still hold a separate meeting on this. I think I probably want to wait till we get more analysis done by MassGIS in terms of what this looks like in terms of the one-third acre density and the facilities. Any questions about that? So you're free to go.
I was